Hey everyone, welcome to the lecture video for week 2 of Race, Crime, and Justice, where we're talking about public opinion. And it's difficult to talk about, and there are a lot of readings on Blackboard this week. I will talk about it more specifically in the intro video, or I did already talk about it in the intro video, depending on what order you watch these in. But we are talking about the issue of public opinion, and there are a lot of readings that are all public opinion based. So hopefully that makes sense. But we do need to talk about this general idea because it's also going to be related to your final project for the class. So right off the bat, a very basic and brief overview of public opinion is exactly what it sounds like. It is the opinion of the general public. It's why the image that you see on this first slide is very straightforward. You are familiar with public opinion, whether you realize it or not. It's a very prevalent thing. It's in our everyday lives, and it's hard to ignore, especially in an era where, we are ever more connected through the internet, whether you get your news or you share or you watch things on TikTok, on Instagram, on YouTube, on Facebook, on X/Twitter, Blue Sky. You're on Tumblr, you make movies, you write books, you blog. It doesn't matter what you do. If you are interacting with another human being in some way, shape, or form, you are being involved in the public opinion. And we see plenty of that happen every day with news. And so it's important to understand that within the criminal justice system, something that has been talked about in some other criminal justice classes is that there is a heavy influence of society on the changes that happen in our own system. And so it's important to remember for my criminal justice students, the general public's view of things can directly impact criminal justice and the system itself. For those of you who are students who are interested in sociology and psychology, and this was something that you were interested in, this is exactly a point in criminal justice that is not necessarily always front-facing and publicly aware. People don't tend to know this, but truly, the general public and general population's thoughts, feelings, opinions, beliefs, ethics, morality, all of these things influence the criminal justice system. And so if you've listened to me rant about this now for just a couple minutes, some of you are definitely thinking, what does this have to do with race, crime, and justice? Well, we talked about it last week. The unfortunate reality is the American history is deeply connected to racism. And so when we talk about race, crime, and justice, we need to understand that the public's opinion on different races, which we can say is racial public opinions, they are going to impact our system. So that's how we loop this all around. So very specifically, one of the biggest pushers of this is news coverage. And this is where I say, regardless of what social media platform you are or are not on, if you just read print news, if you just watch the news locally, or you just engage with national news, whether you get your news from TikTok or Snapchat, or you actually, watch the regular news, it doesn't matter. News coverage in itself is going to have a bigger thing that we talk about in English classes here, and that's bias. Biases, I want to emphasize, anybody who's had me before has heard me say this, if you had me for English. Biases are something that are inherent. They are something that all human beings have. Biases on their own are not inherently good or bad. They simply are. We all have them. We are all influenced by our bias. How we work around this is we do not let our bias make sure or direct exactly what we are going to do. That's how we overcome our bias. And the other thing is to be aware of when people are coming from a place of their bias. And so that's where we're going with this, because specifically in the news, we can point to racial biases in news coverage. We can trace it all through our history, but we can really kind of emphasize there are several examples that still exist in archives and whatnot of newspapers from the 1870s, and this is a direct quote from an article from the 1870s. Chinese immigrants were kidnapping white children, taking them to opium dens, and turning them into opium fiends. Obviously, we should be able to understand that this is sensationalized. This is not necessarily what was exactly happening at this time, which is a whole nother complicated history of opium addiction and opium on Chinese American immigrants, and it's a whole nother thing. But my point being, the racial biases in newspapers from all the way back then were emphasizing a particular group, identifying an issue that they are quote-unquote known for publicly, and making them the demonized, villainized point for the general public to fear. And this is why I say the news coverage does matter. Those racial biases can sneak in regardless of anything else. And so some other more modern ones from like the 1970s, 1980s, and even the 1960s, perhaps some of my favorites. Cocaine gives African Americans super strength and makes them invulnerable to bullets. Now, I'm pretty sure every single one of you that's listening to me and watching this and reading this right now is like, cocaine does not make someone invulnerable to bullets. Nothing makes somebody invulnerable to bullets. But that's the kind of sensationalized news that we would highlight for the rise of the cocaine epidemic in the 1980s. We would say, in the 1970s, 1980s, we'd say, well, when African Americans are doing cocaine, they are imbued with super strength, and shooting them doesn't stop them because they are invulnerable to bullets. That's not true. But it's the way to, again, villainize, to get people to agree that this is a problem and this is the focus that they want to take away. And of course, up until the 90s and 2000s, marijuana use makes Mexican immigrants more violent. Again, not necessarily anything that is true. It is the taking of a stereotype or a particular thing that is happening at the larger level and turning it into this vilified or villainous idea for one particular group. This isn't new. This is not a new concept. Racial biases can be found in lots of different articles, in news coverage of events, in actually just general news coverage. You'll see certain biases will influence the way that certain outlets talk about subjects. And if you want to know way more about that, we're going to talk a little bit about it here in a little bit. But there is plenty of research on the two sides, or rather the two polar extremes of news coverage in the world. We have it both here in America and the United States, but we also have it worldwide. There is a whole issue behind news coverage and the internal biases that people have. So this is why I say this is not something that's new. This is not something that hasn't been deeply explored, but it's also something that we struggle with disconnecting. And so, as I said, if you've had me in English Comp 1 or English Comp 2, you've heard me talk about bias before. And so, like I said, are biases inherently bad? Are they good? What is a bias? completely seriously, biases are not good or bad on their own. It is just what it is. Now, what you do with the bias, that matters. The origins of that bias might matter. And so, specifically, what we're talking about here are implicit biases. So, when we say implicit bias, other terms it's been known as is a hidden bias, an implicit prejudice, a hidden prejudice. All this is an unconscious bias. This means that you do it without thinking. And this is why I said everybody does have these. A lot of times these aren't any kind of consequential, serious things. They don't impact the lives of others. It doesn't change much of the day-to-day, but it's the little things that you make decisions without even thinking about. You choose to wear a color more frequently than any other color, maybe because you associate that color with a negative thing or a positive thing. Like, that's an unconscious bias. Unless you're actively thinking every day, I'm avoiding red because red is a little bit whorish and I don't want to be like that. Like, that's a very different situation. But some people will do that without thinking. That's an unconscious bias. And yes, I used a ridiculous example because that's the easier way to talk about it. Because the reality is, and unfortunately, there are people out there who have implicit biases, unconscious biases about people based off of their skin color, based off of their religious beliefs, based off of the language they speak. And this is where I say, for the most part, there are people who hold hate and anger towards others. And a good portion of the time, it comes from an implicit bias. Sometimes it comes from an experience, but a lot of times it's the hidden bias that people have. It's the implicit prejudice that you don't realize is there. And this is where I say, it's important to learn from it. If you do have something that is an implicit bias that is directed towards other people, I urge you to consider that and think about why you feel that way. Because it might become something that's completely ridiculous, and hopefully you see that and you're like, well, yeah, no, I shouldn't feel that way. And if it is extremely justified, work through that. Why is it justified? And then it's not implicit. Now it's not a hidden thing. Now there's a actual reason. And hopefully, if there is an actual reason, you'll see that it might have been a particular person, not an entire group. That's all I'm going to say about that in particular. So, as we've talked about before with this class in particular, as well as some other criminal justice classes, criminal justice sits in this weird place of social science where there's a level of hard sciences in policing and investigations and things of that nature. So things like to be pretty straightforward with direct answers, but there's a lot of dealing with people and the brain and psychology and dealing with how people interact with each other and how society works. So it's a social science and it is messy. And so very specifically, social scientists, when they're looking for bias, they perform what is called a content analysis. So if you've taken English Comp 1 already, you're familiar with the terms critical analysis or rhetorical analysis. This is what they're doing, but they're doing it on information and data. So it's at a way larger level. This is why if you've taken English Comp 1 with me, you've heard me say you will never use a rhetorical analysis or a critical analysis unless you go into a field that particularly needs it. This is what I'm talking about. Because so what they're doing is, and for anyone who's been so long, content analysis is a very close look at content. So articles, protests, blogs, videos, whatever it might be, they're looking at that content and comparing it to available data, and what they're doing is they're trying to see, is there any kind of emerging trends? And what we mean by emerging trends is Is there a connection between the data? Is there a pattern that we can see? And that's what that emerging trends is. It's something that's coming out. We're starting to see it begin. And so this is where I'll tell you right now, social scientists have been doing content analysis on this very issue, on racial prejudice and bias in news media coverage. This has already begun. And so what we have actually is we have a little bit of the general findings from some of this early data. And so what we have is that truly news outlets tend to cover stories in particular when one of the following three features are involved. So news outlets, and when we say news outlets, we mean everyone. We mean the small little local ones and the large national ones. We tend to cover stories when the suspect is Latinx, Latino, Latina, or Black, when the victim is white, or when the suspect is Black and the victim is white. So please note, there is a difference between A, B, and C. C is a combination of the above, but A and B is slightly different. And so this is why I said this is early data that we already have access to, and if you've been paying attention right now currently in our world, there's a lot of other stuff that's being focused on in the news in particular. There is a heavier focus on South American Latino individuals because there's currently a large deportation movement from ICE here in this country. So right now we're seeing a lot more news stories covering Latino individuals. And these are suspects who are being deported because they are, and I quote, dangerous criminals. But you also can see from other news sources saying that some of those have been founded to be not criminals and not dangerous and still been deported. So it's a whole nother complicated matter. But I want to emphasize, generally speaking, news outlets tend to cover stories if the suspect is of a darker skin complexion, and especially if the victim is white. And oftentimes we cover stories when there are white victims at play. So there's more findings that come from this, and this is the sub piece that I kind of want to talk about. And those of you who've had me in some other classes, you've heard some of this stuff before. Not all of it, but some of it. And we're going to talk a little bit about some examples, which are readings for this week. So some additional findings from these analyses are things like newspaper stories of white victims tend to be longer than stories of Black victims. And it's going back to that previous point where newspaper outlets tend to focus more on stories of white victims. It has to do with it's really bad and weird to say, but the quote-unquote target audience for those news outlets tend to be, middle-aged, older, white individuals, so they want to appeal to that group. So we do see, especially with print media, the focus is more on white victims. We also see that for non-white offenders, the depictions are worse. And we are going to look at examples. We're going to talk about some examples. Because this is something that, if you've been paying attention to those types of cases over the last 30 years, you'll be like, yeah, that's been happening. But when you start to look at the data, it goes back even further. There's plenty of examples, if you really want to dig into it, that go all the way back to the 1950s, the 1940s, heck, even 1939. Cases where African-American youth are depicted in actual articles way worse than other contemporary white offenders. It's very interesting, and that's why I said we're going to talk about some examples. Another thing that we see is that white victims are often depicted as virtuous, with a big exception that I put in brackets right there, except in cases of women who are sexually assaulted by a white male. We're going to talk about that in particular because that's related to the depictions are worse. And we also, black news coverage, and I mean in predominantly white areas and at the national level traditionally, news coverage that involves African Americans tends to be focused on criminal stories, not on feel-good stories. Obviously, in neighborhoods and areas where there is a large African American community, you are going to have way more of those. It's the nature of that type of issue. But I'm emphasizing that at the national level, we do not tend to see a whole lot of feel-good stories about African Americans. There's a big focus on white kids. It's a whole weirder piece. But yeah, so let's talk about briefly some of those depictions and there's no real good segue for this. So let's just talk. So one of the articles that I provided to you all for reading is in particular from Vox. It's the media double standard. And what it does is it's actually a really good example of the way that we talk about this big issue of depiction of offender. So for those of you who don't know, this article originally is 9 years old at this point, which is weird to say, but it is talking about the Brock Turner case. If you do not know or do not remember the Brock Turner case, Brock Turner was a young man. You might remember this picture of him. He was a young man who had a promising swimming career, and he was a student athlete and an all-around uptight, good social kid. And he was charged of sexual assault of a woman on campus. And all the news coverage, all the articles tend to use this photo for him on those articles and highlighted his promising career and his future that was now ruined because of this accusation. He was found guilty, but I want to emphasize that this is the photo that was used for him. It would be a bit before some of them started using his mugshot photo, which we're going to get into that here in just a moment. But I want to emphasize this is what we're talking about. And so, very specifically, like I said, this is the title from the Washington Post. All-American swimmer found guilty of sexually assaulting unconscious woman on Stanford campus. And so we have, like I said, he did get sentenced. But my favorite piece is how consistently Turner was a member of Stanford's varsity swim team, one of the best in the country. He was an All-American swimmer in high school, so good that he tried out for the U.S. Olympic team before he could vote. He went on trial, and legitimately, all throughout this case, the regular coverage from the news media was that he is a promising young man who made a mistake. The classic adage, boys will be boys. Trying to dismiss his activity. I want to emphasize that is not an excuse. That has never been an excuse valid, and it never should be for what he did. That was unacceptable. Yeah, his father said a steep price to pay for 20 minutes of action because the sexual assault only lasted 20 minutes. I'm sorry. That's unacceptable, and it still bothers me to this day. But the Vox article also highlighted, also from the Washington Post, 3 other cases of sexual assault by an African American male and how the articles depicted him. And now I will say, photos of the individuals in particular for these were not necessarily shown, but if they were often the mugshots. But I want to point out, I converted it to a Word document, but this is the Brock Turner Washington Post article. And you can read through it. We're talking it's nearly 7 pages of text. 6 full pages. This one is not even a page. No background into the individual. Just simply, yep, he did it. Here it is. End of story. The coverage is not equal. And for some, you could say, well, that's a good thing. We're not highlighting, we're not trying to make this person seem better than they are. And for that, I understand. But at the same time, we spent so much time giving him so much coverage for a young white man versus a young African American man, 27, 7 years older. We don't need to dive into anything. Like, there is an inherent problem with this. And that's my purpose of highlighting this to all of you, is that there is a disconnect. There is a way that the media covers these things that matters. And so actually, one more that I want to, well, there's 2 more I really want to talk about. But in particular, so very specifically, I found this fairly recently, and I want to share this with all of you. CNN did a report a few years back, actually looking at the anniversary of the George Floyd case, and in particular, actually looked at their initial coverage and all the national coverage of the George Floyd case, and also looking at the initial police release information and how different it was. And it really does emphasize the disconnect, because the initial coverage was that this was just another individual who happened to die in police custody, and it was beyond regular circumstances, and it was a tragedy, and that was it. End of story. And we also identified that, he resisted arrest and all these other things, and very particularly painted a very negative light. And then the video footage went live, and it covered a lot more information, and now it was no longer the same. And so that's why this is a really good article. I highly encourage you to read it. We're not going to talk too much about it because it still gets very controversial for a lot of people, but I want to at least bring your attention to it so you can see this. Another thing in particular I want to do with the picture thing, reminding you, this is the picture we use for Brock Turner on all the news things. Let's look at the New York Times, specifically when Michael Brown was killed. This is the photo they used. I wish I could tell you that I blew up this photo to make it look that bad, but I didn't. The New York Times in 2014, this was the photo that they had at the beginning of the story. Is that a flattering photo of that gentleman? Regardless of how you feel about him or his case, is that an appropriate photo? And I would argue no. And so one of the things that I want to highlight here, so we have, well, let me get back to the PowerPoint and then we'll come back to it, because I believe, we're going to talk about it here in just a second. So we know that this is not fair or equal coverage. So what we've seen is that there is an impact, and there are 3 key impacts of racial bias with news coverage. And the first is that we see an increase in preconceived racial prejudices among the viewers. What we call this actually a little bit as is the Fox News effect. So for those of you who aren't familiar, regardless of your political stance, Fox News has been in trouble for several years for not actually properly informing people and not actually presenting facts as news and things of that nature. And so actually, they had to go officially on record and identify themselves not as a news station, but as an entertainment station. But there are still people that, because they use the term Fox News, still believe it to be a news source. They are, in fact, recognized as an entertainment outlet, not a news outlet. So it's a very important piece, and I want to emphasize that. But the Fox News effect is that people who tend to listen to just that one echo chamber that says the same things over and over and over again, if you feel that way and you engage with that, guess what? It's going to support your thoughts. It's not going to change your mind. It's not going to help you see new perspectives. It's going to just continue to push that. And so we have this increase in preconceived racial prejudice among the viewers. The other thing we're going to see as an impact of racial bias in news media is intensifying perception that people of color are inherently criminals. And this is something that we have seen historically, and we are seeing again. When we have several stories telling the general public that people of a certain color of skin, of nationality, of group identity is bad, we are seeing that we are pointing that in the very personal direction that they are criminals. So now you are getting people that are believing just because they look a certain way that that person must be a criminal. And the other thing, and this is directly for the white members of the United States, there's an increase of white fear or crime, and that leads to the support of harsher punishment for criminals. This is where the unfortunate reality of our country is. If you are white and you are male, you tend to have a bit more power and say and influence. If you are conservative, white, male, cisgendered, and straight, you probably, at least right now, have a very strong push where people in power will listen. Especially if you have money. But my point is, if you do not fit into that cookie cutter, you tend to not have as much of a support behind it. And yeah, we do see a large push for white individuals wanting harsh punishment for criminals, especially conservative white individuals. And I want to emphasize that. We do see it predominantly in conservative. We do see it in liberal and middle of the road and things like that, but we do tend to see it more frequently in conservative circles. So here's the harsh truth or unfortunate reality. The way you want to view it is up to you. But we are not all equal in America. And I don't think that is such a radical thing to say right now. I'm trying not to get emotional as I talk about this. This is a difficult topic for me to talk about, okay? But we are not all equal here in America. Some of the things that I talked about in the last slide are really relevant. This is why I said, unless you are a white, Anglo-Saxon, cisgender, straight male who's somewhat religious, specifically tends to be in Christianity and conservative, you tend to have more power. And this is where I say, I understand as a white man, I have privilege. I can recognize that. But I also know that my privilege is not the same as somebody else. Somebody else who's also white and male may not have the same level of privilege that I have, or might have higher or lower. There's a whole nother complicated thing, and we'll talk about that. But the reality is, here in America, we are not equal. We say that we're the land of the free and it's equal opportunity, but it's not. It really isn't. And we try. We try hard, a lot of us do, to make it equal. And it's an impossible task, I'll be honest with you. It really is impossible to be truly equal. Because you need to convince everyone to be on board with that. And it's unlikely. But very specifically, one of the biggest unequal points in this country we're going to talk about here in a minute, but what we see is typically and statistically, so I want to emphasize, I'm not saying this as a white male saying, look at this. I'm telling you, we have the data to show us that statistically, people of color, and when I say people of color, I mean any individual who is a part of a racial group of darker skin tone that would not be considered white. So I mean Latino, Latina, African American, I'm talking South American, I'm talking Honduran, I'm talking whatever country you want to talk about, whatever nationality you come from. People who do not look white-skinned or dark-skinned Italian. We know that typically, and according to the data we have statistically, these individuals are more likely to live in poverty, reside in substandard living conditions, reside also in high crime areas, go to inferior schools, and when I say inferior, I mean often underfunded, do not have the proper materials, resources, things like that. They receive inadequate health care. They experience employment and housing discrimination, and they tend to face everyday racial slights. And so this is where I will gladly say any number of my students in this class right now, if you are a person of color, I would like you to just think about it. You don't have to say it to anybody, but how many of these are things that also ring true for you? When you were growing up, did you live in poverty? Did you reside in substandard living conditions, live in a high crime area? Did you go to a school that didn't have all the newest technology and had old, outdated books? Did you have access to good health care? As an adult now, do you face any kind of employment or housing discrimination? And in particular, and this is something that through conversations with students, friends, I've heard that a lot of times they've faced some type of racial, and when we say slight, we mean offenses. We're talking comments, things of that nature that are offensive, unfair, cruel, those types of things. This is why I say the harsh truth, we are not all equal. But I want to emphasize the first point of this, more likely to live in poverty. Right at the bottom of this slide, I emphasize the big equalizer is poverty. Okay? And I cannot emphasize that enough. The big equalizer is poverty. So we will continue talking about this, but anybody who has grown up under the poverty line in an area, you might be familiar with several of these statistic issues that are part of our unequal America. If you lived under the poverty line, number one, you already hit number one, but you probably lived in a house where the living conditions were not up to par. You probably You had a higher likelihood that you lived in a high crime area. There was a good reality that if you lived in those neighborhoods, you probably went to a school that was underfunded. And especially if you were in poverty, you also didn't receive adequate health care oftentimes. This is where I say we see statistically people of color experience these things, but the true equalizer is poverty. So I want to talk about white privilege. And this is where I say this is for any of my students who are white. This is definitely an uncomfortable conversation for you to have and consider and hear, but it is important to acknowledge. And for my students who are not white, I'm sure you probably have heard of the term and you probably are aware of it. But white privilege is advantages that non-Latinx, non-Latino, non-Latina white people enjoy in everyday life. And because of the difference in advantages, groups often view social, political, and economic issues very differently. And that's why I said economic, that's the big one. When you have privilege, regardless of white privilege, privilege from finances, whatever it might be, you're going to view social and political issues very differently. So, specifically with white privilege is related to racial biases that do not impact white and sometimes white passing individuals. Okay? White privilege are the things that people see your skin tone, they see you as white or white passing, and for my students of color, you are very familiar with what white passing is. For my students who aren't familiar, white passing literally means if you are of a darker skin tone, that your skin tone in particular is light enough that sometimes people will view you and think you are white even though you aren't. That's what passing is all about. This has a deep-rooted history that goes back to pre-Civil War. So when I say this is something that's always been there, it's something that's always been there. But white privilege is specifically related to the racial bias, specifically the things that have to do with the color of your skin. Privilege is different. Individuals can and do receive discrimination based off age, gender, identity, disability, religion, financial situation. You pick it, you name it, I guarantee there's privilege. People will discriminate based off of any number of factors. And that's why I emphasize poverty is the big equalizer when we talk about criminal justice in particular. Okay? Big equalizer for criminal justice privilege is poverty. There's a lot of racial bias and it's connected to poverty, but it's also a little more complicated, and we will talk a little bit about that. So, let's talk about the criminal justice system. Now, let's talk about fear of crime, because this is something that criminal justice organizations use as a measuring tool. And the question is, do you fear walking alone in your neighborhood? And again, I'm not asking you to necessarily tell me, but I want you to think about it truly yourself. Do you fear walking alone in your neighborhood? Now, I will state, for all of my female students, I'm going to ask you to consider that question not based off of your gender, because I understand that there's a whole thing connected with women because of victimization and assault that happens, and I'm not belittling that. But I want to emphasize, do you fear walking alone in your neighborhood outside of that particular piece? Okay. So here we have a term, and it's important to identify as punitiveness. And that's the belief that the criminal justice system should treat criminals more harshly. So in general, the criminal justice system, this is where my CJ majors, you already have heard this, but for those of you who aren't, Within the criminal justice system, there are different ways that we punish or rehabilitate. The primary goal of the criminal justice system as a whole is to punish, not necessarily always, but it's always trying to uphold the laws. Our correctional system, our juvenile system, its primary focus is on rehabilitating. And what we mean by that is that individuals who commit a crime will spend a sentence, will spend time, and the goal is at the end of their time, they will be able to re-enter society and be positive members. That's the goal. Doesn't work for everybody, doesn't work in all areas. It's complicated, it's not a simple issue, but it's important to note that that's part of quote-unquote punishment in the criminal justice system. Punitive damages, punitiveness, and punishment is the act of punishing an individual. And so punitiveness is this belief within the system that we need to treat criminals more harshly. Instead of trying to rehabilitate, we want to punish them. And so our most harsh criminal sentence that we can do is the death penalty. And I will say there is a oddly depressing statistic about the death penalty that shows that, I'm trying to remember the information now. I feel bad that I don't have it prepared for you right now. I will definitely add it somewhere in one of the videos coming up, or at least I'll try. But what we've known is that some of the data shows us that when an African American or Latino suspect is being put up for the death penalty, they tend to get that sentence more frequently versus a white individual. And there's a whole nother troubling piece about the color of the victim also matters. If the victim is white and the offender is of a different ethnic background and a different racial color, they tend to get the death penalty more frequently. I forget the statistic now. It's really bothering me, but it's significantly higher. So I want to at least emphasize that there is some science that supports this idea that there might be some racial bias here. So this is where I'm struggling to say this only because in a post George Floyd Black Lives Matter era, I think there's a change overall in the view on police. But generally speaking, white populations tend to view the police more positively than any other racial group. This also depends on particular region and area of the country. So I just want to put that out there. So when we talk about some issues within this system, we need to talk about some injustices. So in the 2013 national survey data, 68% of Black Americans believe that the system was biased against them, whereas 25% of whites believe the system was biased against Black people. So hear that again and think about this. 68% of Black Americans believe the system was biased against them. So in 2013, a majority of African Americans believed that the system was working against them. At that same time, a quarter of the white citizens believed the system was biased against African Americans. This is why I said, in a post-George Floyd 2020 Black Lives Matter protesting world, I think this information, this data has definitely changed. But I don't know that national survey data information for that time. So it's something I would have to look into. But at the very least, I wanted to emphasize that this is not a new thing, and this is not something that, is only minimal. This is something that impacts a lot of people. And In 2002, national survey data also gave us 75% of black Americans believed that police treated minorities worse than whites. 50% of Latinos believe police treated minorities worse than whites. And 75% of white people believe that police treat everyone equally. Yeah. That's all I'm going to say about that. So, why the disparities? And before I get into this, I do want to emphasize, I did say I wanted to talk about two other example articles real quick, and I did provide them to you. They're from the New York Times, and one is about Michael Brown, and the other one's about Timothy McVeigh. And I highlighted just a couple things, and it goes back to the way that we depict things and people. I hate that I said things right away. The way we depict people in particular in the public. And so, again, New York Times did both of these articles. They're quite a few years apart, but so the New York Times identified Michael Brown and specified he was no angel, with public records and interviews with friends and family revealing both problems and promise in his young life. He lived in a community that had rough patches, and he dabbled in drugs and alcohol. He had taken to rapping in recent months, producing lyrics that were by turns contemplative and vulgar, and he got into at least one scuffle with a neighbor. This is where I ask every single one of you, have you ever had a rough patch? Especially when you were a kid under the age of 18? You don't have to answer this, but did you ever dabble in drugs or alcohol? Did you ever consider rapping or any type of singing and write down lyrics? Did you ever write poetry? Did you ever write anything that was kind of inappropriate, whether it was violent or just inappropriate for other reasons? Like, what I'm seeing being described here is normal kid stuff. But the way it's depicted is trying to paint him as a bad person. Almost. And then, 1995, Timothy McVeigh. Mr. McVeigh himself has refused to cooperate with investigators, meeting their entreaties to answer questions with a rigid, stone-faced silence, the officials said. One investigator said that Mr. McVeigh had displayed no reaction, even when he had been shown photographs of maimed and dead children being taken from Alfred P. Murrah Federal Building. So, stone-faced silence. No reaction. That's not positive, but it's not really negative. Mr. McVeigh's motive appears to center on his extreme anger over the deaths of more than 80 people in the fiery assault in Waco, but some investigators are uncertain of his role within what they believe is a small group of conspirators. Motive appears to center on his extreme anger, and my favorite piece about this, some law enforcement, so very specifically, Pentagon officials confirmed at this time that he was an infantryman and served in the Persian Gulf conflict. So very specifically, some law enforcement officials said that Mr. McVeigh's Army service had been a catalyst in his evolution from the adventurous teenager from Lockport, New York, to embittered veteran outraged by the government's attempt to restrict firearms. Adventurous teenager to embittered veteran outraged. Michael Brown was no angel. He lived in a community that had rough patches, and he dabbled in drugs and alcohol. He was an adventurous teenager. Yeah. The way we phrase these things, no matter how subtle, does matter. It does have a larger impact on how we view individuals and how others view them. So, why do we see these disparities? So often, African Americans will cite biases in the criminal justice system for the circumstances that they face. And I want to emphasize, I don't want to belittle that at all. There are definitely racial biases within the criminal justice system and the larger United States system as a whole that works against a lot of people. African Americans in particular get hit by this, but so do several other groups. And that's why I remind you, go back to the earlier point. Poverty is the great equalizer. Oftentimes, when you hear, and it sounds weird, heartwarming tales of former like white supremacists, white people meeting and talking with African Americans and realizing they were wrong, they give it up and they become advocates for African Americans. A lot of times, what they find they bond over is how the system treated them because they grew up in poverty. Poverty is the big equalizer, people. So I will emphasize, I do not want to belittle that African Americans definitely face some harsh racial biases that directly impact their opportunity, but this also applies to any number of Middle Eastern people, whether they're from Iraq, Iran, Syria, Egypt. You pick your part of the Middle East, and yeah, they also are affected by this. You pick anyone from Mexico, South America, any South American country, Spain, anyone international. I'm going to tell you right now, if they come here, they face different discriminations based off of the color of their skin. That's the reality. And often, I want to point this one out because, boy, does it make me laugh in a way of, this is really stupid. Often, white Americans tend to cite young African Americans, quote, disrespect for authority and the actual higher rates of criminal behavior that they have. So going back to that, he was into rap music. A lot of times people across the board like to point to rap being this terrible influence on individuals. It really isn't. It's a more complicated factor than that, but I want to emphasize that the disrespect for authority can come from rap, but it can also come from some cultural parts of that I simply cannot speak on because I'm not African American. I can't speak on African American culture. But what I can speak on is the way that white Americans tend to look at it, because I know a lot of white Americans. And yeah, a lot of times they will say, well, they were very disrespectful towards authority. Well, yeah, guess what? Authority kind of deserved it because they were being bad. That's my personal stance, but it's a whole nother complicated matter. And some of the things that come up because of this are boys will be boys. Kids are dumb. Kids make mistakes. Yeah, we need to stop treating their, quote, disrespect for authority as them trying to fight and more being kids. It's definitely something I'll die on that hill for. And the other thing I can definitely say that is related to these disparities is white Americans are more likely to attribute criminal behavior to an individual's failing than to poverty, unemployment, and other external factors that led to the commitment of a crime. And so I would like to put an asterisk on that and say, I don't think necessarily that it's white Americans as a whole. I think it's traditional white conservative Americans are more likely to attribute any criminal behavior to individual failings rather than poverty, unemployment, or other external factors. This is where I say social sciences, having a social services, having things designed in our society to help people when they need it, those are things that have been proven to reduce criminal behavior. It's not individual failings. It's the failings of our system. Those are the pieces that need fixed. Those are the things that lead to criminal behavior. When we can fix it, we'll lower crime. We'll never be able to truly get rid of it, but we will reduce it. And so, a real ethical question, which is a classic one, do you steal a loaf of bread to feed your starving family? In the scenario, I'm going to tell you right now, you don't have a job. There's no way for you to get a job right now. You are locked out of getting any kind of job for at least 2 weeks. Do you steal a loaf of bread to feed your starving family, or do you let them starve? That's an ethical dilemma. And right there also proves the whole larger aspect of criminal behavior. It is circumstances outside of a particular individual that tends to lead to crime. That's it. That's the end of the slideshow. That's the end of the presentation. Thank you very much. Like I said, this is a difficult topic to talk about, and it's very emotionally charged. So I want to apologize straightforward if I offended anyone or I said anything that bothered anyone. Please, reach out, let me know. My purpose was not to do that, but to simply bring awareness to this and discuss this, because this is an issue that we see, and hopefully you understand that the way, as a kind of wrap-up thing, the way that people view things and the impact that people's opinions have on society do matter. The way people view them is going to continue to push for the social programs that are there. I'd love to make the wonderful statement that if we could, as a whole, as people, if we could find a way to work together and actually put aside all the stupid little differences and get to know each other and address the real issues, the external factors, the things that we need, I want to believe that we could live in a better place. I believe that we can make our country great. We can make America great, but it's not going to be from electing one president or one candidate or doing one thing. It's going to be considering the external factors. It's going to come down to fixing poverty. It's going to come down to addressing the most vulnerable people of our society. That's going to be the way forward. And so hopefully more and more people see that, and we can build towards that. All right. Thank you very much. Thank you for letting me rant there at the end. I will see you all in the discussion board in the next video.